Hello, my name is Aiden McNulty, and today I'm going to be covering slow flight and steep turns. The first thing I want to talk about is what slow flight is. The airplane flying handbook describes it as flying 5 to 10 knots above the 1G stalling speed of the aircraft. And we practice slow flight to replicate the takeoff and approach phases of flight so that pilots can better learn to control the aircraft at slow airspeeds while still being at a safe altitude to do so. To achieve slow flight, the pilot should run through CHAPS first, which is an acronym for clearing turns, heading, altitude, place to land, and safety of flight. The pilot should make sure that they are at least 1500 AGL, that they have somewhere in front of them to land, and that there's nothing about the maneuver that is going to compromise the safety of flight. Once they've gone through CHAPS, they can begin to slow down the aircraft by reducing power and increasing pitch. Liberty recommends for the Cessnas to bring power back to 1500 RPM, and then once you begin to slow down, you can bring your flaps out incrementally. Once you're below 110 knots, you can bring your flaps to 10 for the Cessnas, and then once you're below 85, you can bring your flaps to 20 and then 30 incrementally. Once you have achieved slow flight and you're 5 to 10 knots above that stalling speed, you can increase your power settings to maintain that speed and altitude. For Liberty's Cessnas, that's staying at about 50 knots and around 2000 RPM. To recover from slow flight, you should push power to maximum, reduce your pitch, and bring flaps up incrementally. You should bring your flaps up to 20 immediately, and then once you're above 60 knots, flaps up to 10, and then once you're above 65, bring them up to 6. Bring the flaps back up. The characteristics of slow flight. There are various characteristics that pilots should remain aware of. First is, of course, the low airspeed and high angles of attack associated with slow flight. Because of the decreased airflow over the control surfaces, your control inputs can be less effective, and many pilots describe this as having mushy controls. Additionally, increased adverse yaw. Especially at higher power settings, during slow flight, adverse yaw can be worse, and it will require a lot of opposite rudder inputs. And then a pilot should also be aware of the stall likelihood during slow flight, as you're very close to the stall speed, and then especially during turns when that stall speed is increased, you should make sure that you are staying high enough to not stall the plane. Additionally, I want to talk about steep turns. Steep turns is a 360-degree turn at 45 to 60 degrees of bank. For Liberty requires private students to get to 45, and then commercial get to 50 degrees of bank. And we practice these to demonstrate load factor, and so that pilots can better control the plane at high load factors and high bank angles. When doing a steep turn, the first thing the pilot should do is run through CHAPS again, just like they did in slow flight, and then they should begin to come to their desired speed. When in a steep turn, stall speed is increased dramatically, so you have to make sure that you're at a high enough airspeed to not risk stalling, but also not going above the maneuvering speed of the aircraft. For the Cessna 172s, they recommend you stay at about 95 knots, which is a power setting of about 2250. Then, once you come into the turn, you can bank into that 45 or 50 degree turn for Liberty students, and then you have to make sure that you're using rudder inputs to keep the turn coordinated. And then because of that horizontal and vertical lift, you have to increase RPM to about 2300 for the Cessnas and pull back on the elevator some. And then once you've come around to you're coming up on your 360-degree heading, you can begin to roll out and adjust your power settings back down to make sure you stay level. Some important characteristics of steep turns to keep in mind are the vertical and horizontal lift. A portion of your vertical lift is being turned into a horizontal component of lift when in a steep turn, and because of this, you have to pull back on the elevator to make sure you have sufficient vertical lift during the turn. Load factor is a major factor during these turns. At a bank of 45 degrees, your load factor is 1.41, and at 60 degrees, your load factor is 2.0, which essentially means the effective weight of your aircraft at 60 degrees has been doubled. And because of the load factor, it also increases the stall speed. The airplane flying handbook says that an aircraft that stalls at 50 at straight and level flight can stall at 70 knots in a steep turn at 60 degrees. It's also good to be aware of the overbanking tendency of an aircraft. Many aircraft have positive or neutral stability, just like the Cessna does, but when reaching high angles or high banks, aircraft can begin to continue to turn into the turn, requiring conscious opposite aileron pressure during the turn. And that is my presentation on the slow flight and steep turns. These are the references that I used, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you.